Okay, seventh graders, I'm really sad because I can't be with you today at your awards assembly. But I knew that if the eighth graders got story time with Miss Scott, and if the sixth graders got story time with Miss Scott, that you might also want story time with Miss Scott. So I have recorded this video just for you so that you too can enjoy story time. The story I'm going to tell today is actually one of my favorites because it's got some creepy little parts to it. Um, Nobody gets their arms chopped off, nobody gets a toe chopped off, or part of their heel or anything like that, but it's kind of scary and dark. So the story is Hansel and Gretel. Can you see it? Yep, Hansel and Gretel. And this version by Will Moses is just one of my favorites because of the way that he tells the story. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy. Just sit back and relax and let your imagination take you on a magical journey. So long ago, there lived a woodcutter and his wife and their two children, Hansel and Gretel. But what you need to know is that his wife is actually their stepmother. And if you know anything about folk tales and fairy tales, usually stepmothers don't always work out too well. So they lived at the edge of a forest in a beautiful cottage, and for the most part, they were as happy as can be. The woodcutter would travel every day into the dark, kind of scary forest, and he would cut wood, and he would sell the wood, and they had a happy living. But a famine struck the land. They had less and less to eat every day, and the cost of food went up, and no matter how much the woodcutter cut, he was not able to feed his family. One night, it had been particularly bad. They had had very little for dinner, and while laying in bed that night, the stepmother turned to her husband, their father, and she said to him, "I believe that the time has come to take drastic action to save our family." And he turned to her and said, "My dear, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, we have no more food, and with 4 mouths to feed, surely all 4 of us will die. However, I have a plan. Tomorrow, when you go into the forest to cut wood, I will come with you, and we will bring the children. You and I will work and will cut, and at the end of the day, we will leave the children in the dark forest to die." Well, of course, the father said, "I cannot leave my children in the woods to die. Why would you even have such a plan?" But the stepmother was cunning and shrewd, and she knew if they didn't do something drastic, she too would starve. So she continued to nag at her husband. "Well, don't you see? This is the only plan that works. We have to get rid of these 2 children or else all 4 of us will die. You might as well just start building 4 coffins now." He didn't give in to her plan, so she continued to nag. And he didn't give in to her plan, so she continued to nag. And as we all know, when you've just been nagged and nagged and nagged and nagged, sometimes you do eventually give in. So the father agreed that the following morning he would take Hansel and Gretel into the forest and leave them there to die. Luckily, Hansel and Gretel were not asleep in their beds. They had been overhearing this conversation through the thin walls of their cottage, and they turned to each other and said, "Do you want to die? Do you want to die? No? No? Well, then we'd better come up with a plan." Hansel, the brother, was a very smart fellow, and he turned to his sister Gretel and he said, "Gretel, never fear, don't you fret. I have an idea that will save our life." He waited until he was quite sure that his parents had gone completely to sleep, and then he snuck out of his bed, tiptoed down the stairs, snuck open the front door of the cottage, and went out into the front yard where he saw, gleaming in the moonlight, many white pebbles. He started to pick up these pebbles and put them into his pockets. He put pebbles in his pockets until his pockets were bulging and full, and then he tiptoed back inside the house, back up into his bed, and fell asleep next to his sister. The following morning came, and the stepmother said to the children, "Oh, children, today we're going to do something a little bit different. You see, your father and I are both going to go work in the forest, and you will come with us. We'll travel as a family." Hansel and Gretel knew the plan, but of course they had to go along with it. Their stepmother gave each of them 1 piece of crunchy dry bread, and she said to them, "This crunchy dry bread is your lunch. You must save it until lunchtime, or else you'll be hungry." So again, they began to travel as a family, into the dark, scary woods. Well, a little ways into the forest, Hansel reached into his pocket and pulled out the first white pebble, and then bent down to leave it on the path. The stepmother, again a shrewd woman, turned quickly and said to him, "What are you doing there on the ground, Hansel? You need to continue walking with us. Quickly, quickly now." He said, "Oh, stepmother, I'm sorry. I thought I saw our white cat following us, and I was encouraging her to go back to our cottage." The stepmother said, "Do not worry yourself with cats. Please, please, continue on." As they went, Hansel had to be very sneaky about leaving his trail of white pebbles, but he managed to do so. And once they had gotten sufficiently deep into the woods, the stepmother stopped and the father stopped, and they said to the children, "Okay, children, here we shall build you a fire, and you shall stay here. We will cut down trees in the surrounding forest, and at the end of the day, we'll come back to get you." So they built a fire, and so they left the children with only their crusts of dry bread, and they traveled a little ways away from the children. Well, again, that stepmother, she was very cunning and shrewd. She said to her husband, "We need to make sure they think we are working here in the woods." So she found a tree that had nice supple branches, and she grabbed a branch and stretched it down towards the ground and attached it to the ground with a rock, but not so tight that it couldn't still move. Therefore, every time that a little breeze blew by that branch, it knocked against the other trees around it. And so the children thought they could continue to hear their father and stepmother cutting wood. But alas, they were not cutting wood. They quickly returned home. Hansel and Gretel sat and waited and sat and waited, and when lunchtime came, they were hungry. They began to nibble at their dry, crusty bread, and eventually they grew so tired that they fell asleep and took a nap. Well, the day went on, and the sun began to set, and they awoke and realized, "We're in the dark, scary woods alone, and our parents have not come back." Gretel became particularly distressed, but Hansel said to her, "Never fear, I have a plan. When the moon rises so that we can see again, we will simply follow our trail of white pebbles back to our house and therefore be safe." So sure enough, when the moon rose, all of the white pebbles glistened like little beacons, and they followed those little pebbles all the way back to the cottage. Well, when they arrived at the cottage door, they knocked, and who should open it but the stepmother? And in her head she thought, "Oh, my plan did not work. These children are back." But she had to pretend to welcome them back, although she did reprimand them. "Children, how dare you fall asleep in the dark, scary forest? You should have returned home right away." Well, the days went on, and luckily the famine ended, and they lived happily again as a family. But as happens in fairy tales and folk tales, something bad comes around again, and the famine returned. The family was once again hungry and didn't have enough. And the stepmother again one night turned to her husband and said, "We must take these children into the forest and leave them, or else all of us will die." Again, the father did not want to do this plan, but the stepmother harassed and harassed and nagged, and eventually he gave in. But luckily, once again, Hansel and Gretel had heard the argument through the walls of the cottage and again decided to make a plan. But this time, when Hansel tried to tiptoe downstairs to go collect pebbles, the front door was bolted and locked shut. Very worried, he returned upstairs and told his sister of the disaster, but they decided when morning came, they would make a plan. Somehow they would survive. Morning came, and the stepmother again said, "Children, today you shall journey with us into the woods so we can all cut wood together." And she gave them each one dry crust of bread, for that was all they had. And she said to them, "Children, this is your lunch. You must save it. This is all you'll have today." Well, as they left the house, Hansel realized he was going to have to leave behind pieces of his bread as a marker along the way. So he did. He broke off a little crust. And as he bent down to leave it on the path, the stepmother, again, very shrewd and cunning, turned to him and said, "Hansel, what are you doing there on the path?" He said, "Oh, stepmother, I thought I saw a bird caught in a twig." She said, "Hansel, birds do not live on the ground. They live up in the trees. Come along." They led them into the deep, dark woods. They led them farther in than before, but again built them a fire. Well, it was winter now, and the fire kept them warm, but the children were hungry and tired, and alas, again they fell asleep. And when they woke, it was dark, and their parents were nowhere to be found. Hansel had no bread in his pockets because he had left it behind as a pathway, but Gretel had some, and she shared with her brother, and Hansel again said, "When the moon rises high in the winter sky, we will use it as our guide to follow it back home." But when the moon rose and they started looking around, they couldn't find a single crust of bread. For you see, all of the woodland creatures had gobbled it up. They too were hungry. Oh, Gretel was worried, and Hansel was worried too. They started wandering through the woods trying to find their way home, but instead they grew more and more lost. Very dismayed, they finally fell asleep, only to wake the following morning more scared and more hungry than before. But luckily for them, they heard a hoo in a tree. And when they looked, the hoo was a beautiful white snowy owl. The owl seemed to lure them along a path in the woods, and so they trusted her and they followed her. And sure enough, the owl led them right into a clearing. In that clearing was a magical house. The owl seemed to land on the roof of this house, and then they could no longer see the owl, but they no longer cared because they realized the magical house was made of gingerbread. And it was covered with frosting and candies. The windows were made of clear sugar candy, and there were gumdrop accoutrements and sweet cakes lined the path to the door, and they were very hungry. The children began to nibble parts of the house, to devour it actually, when all of a sudden, from within the house, they heard a voice saying, "Who's that nibbling on my house? Is it a tiny forest mouse?" The children were very frightened, but before they could even respond, the door of the house flung open, and who should be standing there but a very, very old woman. She gave them a squinty look, and she said, "How did you children come to find my house?" They said, Oh, please forgive us, old woman. You see, we were lost in the woods. Our parents abandoned us, and we've had no food for a whole day, and we were just very hungry. We hope you'll forgive us. We hope you'll understand." Well, this old woman said, "Oh, children, you're hungry, you're tired. Please, please, come into my house. I will feed you breakfast." Well, they trusted her because she was an old woman, and who doesn't trust nice old ladies? But they should not have trusted her, for you see, she was instead a wicked old witch with magical powers. She was actually the snowy owl who had lured them in. She fed them breakfast, pancakes and bananas and hot chocolate, which is a wonderful breakfast, and then she showed them 2 very warm beds in which they could sleep. But again, they should not have trusted her, for the minute they were asleep, she cast a spell over them that they should not wake for several hours. She leaned over Hansel first and decided to herself, this fellow would be a wonderful fellow to eat. So she scooped up his body. She was very strong, you see, and she carried him out next to her house into a cage made of twigs and bones, and she left him in the cage. Several hours later, when they both awoke, Gretel realized that her brother was no longer next to her in the bed, and she became scared. When she ran out into the kitchen, there was the witch in her true form, cackling and laughing. "Ha, ha, ha, ha! I have captured your brother, and I will kill him unless you help me feed him." Well, Gretel wasn't quite sure what that meant. "What do you mean, help me feed him?" And the witch admitted to her, "I'm going to fatten him up and eat him for dinner." Oh, Gretel cried and cried, but there was nothing she could do if she didn't help the witch. The witch would kill her brother either way. So the next few days passed. Gretel was forced to go out to the cage and feed her brother very fattening foods, but she told her brother the plan. She told him she intends to fatten you up and eat you. And again, Hansel, being a very smart boy, found a chicken bone in the corner of the cage and saved it in his pocket. After several days of fattening him up, the witch went outside and told Hansel, "Stick your finger through the slats of the cage so I can feel how fat you're getting." But instead of sticking his finger through the cage, Hansel quickly pulled the chicken bone out of his pocket and shoved it through the slats. The witch was very smart, and she was magically strong, and she had a delicious house, but she had terrible vision, and she fell for the trick. She didn't realize it was a chicken bone, and when she felt it, she thought, "Oh, no, this won't do. He's not fat enough." Some more days went by, and poor Gretel was forced to continue force-feeding her brother fattening foods. And again the witch came out to check on Hansel, and when she asked to see his finger, he shoved out the bone. This continued several more times, and finally the witch, in exasperation, said to Hansel, "I don't care how fat you are. I'm done with this. I'm going to cook you and eat you." The witch had in her yard a very large brick oven. It was very big, and you had to sort of climb up to see inside of the oven, and there was a very big metal door on the oven as well. Well, the witch went out and she put wood into the oven and she threw a match into the oven and the fire started and she let it burn for a while. Well, the witch realized, "I don't want to have two kids hanging around my house. I'm going to trick the girl into getting into my oven." She's such a cunning, terrible witch. So she told Gretel, Come, help me feed the oven." And again, Gretel was worried, "If I don't help this witch, she's going to kill my brother. What should I do?" But Gretel was not a stupid girl. She was pretty smart too. So the witch took her out to the oven, and the witch said, "All right, my dear, I need you to climb up into the oven and check and see if it's hot enough." Well, Gretel didn't want to climb into an oven because she had figured out that probably the witch was going to try to cook her in it. So Gretel showed her smarts too. She turned to the witch and she said, "I'm just a little girl. I couldn't possibly climb into that large oven. I don't know how. I'm not big enough. Could you show me how?" The witch fell for her trick. When the witch tried to climb up to peek into the oven, Gretel shoved her in. Yay! This is the part where you can clap and cheer. Yay! From inside of the oven, a terrible howl arose. Oh! And black smoke came out the top of the oven chimney and filled the whole sky. The witch was dead. Gretel ran over to the cage and quickly opened it up and got her brother Hansel out, and they both decried, "Yay, the witch is dead!" You might be tempted to sing that song, "Ding dong, the witch is dead, witch, old witch, the wicked witch," but that's from a different story. We shouldn't sing that now. Yeah, no, the witch is dead. Hansel and Gretel went into the house, filled their pockets with goodies and sweets and parts of the candy house, and they also stumbled across the witch's treasure, gold and silver coins and jewels and other magic things. And they decided, "We shall return home with all these goodies and with all this money and be happy again." So they traveled through the forest, the dark, spooky forest, but they felt more brave this time because they had defeated a witch. They traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled, but finally they came to a very wide river. And they realized, "We can't cross this river. We're but two small children." What should they see in the river but another beautiful white bird? It was a very large white swan. Now, you see, the last time that they trusted a white bird, things didn't turn out too well for them. It was the owl that was really the witch, and then they almost died. But they felt in their heart that they could trust this white bird. So they called out, "Oh, white swan, we've escaped from the witch of the forest, and we would like to go back home. Can you help us cross this river?" And the swan was good, and she allowed the children to climb back onto her back, and she helped them across the watery way. Well, the children continued to travel until they began to see things they recognized, parts of the forest that they knew, and after only a little bit more traveling, sure enough, they stumbled across their cottage. Home at last. They were a little bit worried because their parents had, after all, abandoned them twice in the forest, but they longed to be home. They knocked on the door, and who should answer but their father? Oh, he was so delighted to see the children that he loved, and he welcomed them in, and they said, "Father, we've escaped from a terrible witch with all of this gold and silver." And the father had good news too. He told them that their stepmother, who was really wicked as well, had died of what the doctor proclaimed a dark, cold heart. And so they lived happily for the rest of their days with their loving father, with the witch's goods. And you, children, should not fear either, for your parents love you, and even if they abandon you in the woods, I will come help you out. Your school librarian. Have a wonderful day.